you stand in the dim silence of a chapel. The air is damp, heavy with the smell of melted wax and old stone. Candles burn low, their flames trembling, their light caught on the polished wood of a crucifix that hangs above the altar. The figure of Christ looks down from the cross, his face carved in suffering, but he does not speak. He cannot. You are small, your linen dress thin against the chill. Your hands clutch at your chest, fingers digging into your own skin as if that fragile gesture could protect you. Eyes wide, fixed forward, but you feel him behind you. His breath brushes your ear. His voice, low and steady, coils around your fear like smoke, a whisper no one else will hear. He is a priest. His robe is black, simple, heavy. His hand hovers near your shoulder, too close, and you know there is no one here who will pull it away. The crucifix does not move. The candles do not flicker. The chapel, built for prayer, has become a cage. Your heart races. You want to flee, to cry out, but your voice feels locked inside your chest. You know what is expected of you: silence, obedience, submission. The same lessons that were spoken in sermons, sung in chants, repeated until they carved themselves into the minds of children like you. The church was a father, and fathers demanded loyalty. Fathers demanded silence. This is not the first time. Not for him, and not for the place itself. The stones have seen it before. They have absorbed whispers, prayers, confessions, and cries that never reached heaven. Each one buried beneath the weight of ritual, hidden beneath the authority of holy robes. You are not here by choice. You are here because faith was not only salvation, it was power. Power that could bless, and power that could wound. And when that power stood close, cloaked in black, whispering at your ear, there was no escape. Before we continue, if you value dark and forgotten history, consider subscribing. Tell us where you are watching from. It truly helps us create more stories like this. Now, back to the video. This is the shadow of medieval priests. This is the fear that children carried. The Middle Ages in Europe were not only an age of castles and knights, they were also the age of the church. In towns and villages, in cities, and across the countryside, the church was everywhere. Its towers were the tallest structures. Its bells marked the hours. Its rituals guided life from birth to death. Every baptism, every marriage, every funeral was shaped by its presence. No king, no lord, no soldier held the same power over the soul as the priest who stood before the altar. By the 14th century, the church was not a single voice, but a vast system. From the great cathedrals of France to the small chapels of rural England, its authority was absolute. Priests were not merely spiritual guides. They were confessors, judges, and keepers of the invisible boundary between salvation and damnation. To anger a priest was to risk your eternal soul. For peasants who already endured hunger, war, and plague, the soul was their last possession, and the church held it in its hands. Children grew up within this system. From the moment of baptism, they were told the priest was a father, a shepherd of souls, an extension of God's authority on earth. In paintings and sermons, priests were depicted as guardians, clothed in robes of black or white, their presence binding heaven and earth together. To a child, their word was law. To question it was unthinkable. But authority creates shadows. The same walls that echoed with chants and hymns also absorbed secrets. The confessional, meant as a place of forgiveness, became a chamber where innocence could be manipulated. The altar, meant to be holy, became a stage for silent dominance. And because priests were cloaked in sanctity, their sins were rarely challenged. The medieval worldview reinforced this silence. Obedience was not only a virtue, it was survival. For peasants, resistance against authority, whether lord or priest, often ended in punishment. For children, resistance was almost impossible. Fear of sin was woven into every lesson, every sermon. To resist a priest was to risk damnation, to risk burning in the fires of hell. What child could stand against that? The institutional church itself was not blind to corruption. Councils met, rules were written, reforms were demanded. Bishops condemned unholy priests. Stories circulated of clergy accused of breaking their vows. But change was slow, and silence was often easier. Priests were too essential to remove, too sacred to be doubted, too powerful to be accused without fear of reprisal. A child's voice, even if raised, could not pierce the shield of holy authority, and so fear became a part of childhood in medieval Europe. Not the fear of war or famine, though those were real enough. It was the quieter fear, carried into the chapels and cloisters, where candles burned and crucifixes loomed. The fear of being alone with a man whose robe signified both holiness and danger. The fear of whispers that could never be spoken aloud. The medieval world was built on hierarchy. At the top, God. Beneath him, his church. Beneath the church, lords, knights, merchants, peasants. And at the very bottom, children small, voiceless, dependent. In such a structure, the abuse of power was not an accident. It was a consequence. The very design of the world allowed it to flourish. When we look back now, centuries later, we often see cathedrals, relics, illuminated manuscripts. We see devotion, art, the beauty of medieval faith. But hidden within those same walls was something else. Fear. A fear carried not by theologians or chroniclers, but by children. Children whose stories rarely reach the page, but whose silence tells us more than words ever could. This is the context of medieval clerical authority. A world where religion was law, where priests were fathers of souls, and where the smallest voices could be smothered beneath the weight of silence. The victims were children, small, voiceless, bound within a world that taught them to obey. In medieval Europe, childhood was brief, but even in those short years, the priest was always present. He baptized the infant, blessed the meals, heard the confessions, and guided the prayers before bed. To the parents, the priest was a shepherd. To the children, he was a figure of awe and dread. Daily life for a child in the 14th century was marked by hardship. Many were born into peasant families, where survival meant labor from an early age. Boys tended sheep, carried water, gathered firewood. Girls spun wool, cared for siblings, prepared meals. Childhood was not freedom, but preparation for servitude. Yet even in these simple tasks, the church was never absent. The parish bell dictated when they worked, when they prayed, when they rested. Faith was woven into the rhythm of their small lives, and within that faith, priests carried unmatched authority. When they spoke, children listened. When they commanded, children obeyed. Few dared question. In confession, a child whispered sins to the ear of a man who claimed to speak for God. Those whispers often carried secrets of fear, of small mistakes, of guilt that children barely understood. The priest's role was to absolve, but absolution required intimacy, proximity, vulnerability. And it was there, in that silence, that danger lived. The victims carried their fear quietly. Rarely did they speak of it, even to their parents. For a child to accuse a priest was unthinkable. Parents themselves often dismissed such words as childish imagination, or worse, as sinful lies. The reputation of the church was too powerful, the weight of the priest's robe too heavy. Families depended on the sacraments, baptisms, marriages, burials. To oppose the priest was to risk exclusion from those rites, to risk eternal condemnation. So silence was passed from child to parent, from parent to neighbor, until it became the air the village breathed. The faces of the victims remain invisible in records. We know them only through hints, through sermons condemning clerical corruption, through trials where abuse was whispered but rarely punished, through scattered chronicles that spoke of unholy priests without naming the children they harmed. The victims were anonymous, erased by time, by fear, by the church's desire to preserve its image. Their silence was not accidental. It was demanded, yet we can imagine their lives. A girl of 8, clutching a wooden cross carved by her father, waiting outside the chapel while her family prayed. A boy of 10, sent to assist in the sacristy, arranging candles while the priest's shadow grew long across the stone floor. Their worlds were small fields, hearths, and the ever-present church. To be singled out by a priest was both honor and curse. Honor in the eyes of parents who believed their child chosen for special service. Curse in the reality of what that service could mean. Their fear was not the loud fear of battle or plague. It was the quiet fear of being alone in a stone room, of whispers too close to the ear, of a hand that lingered too long. It was the fear of knowing that no one would believe them, that the crucifix above the altar would never speak, that the candles would keep burning as if nothing had happened. The victims carried this silence into adulthood. Some buried it, others passed it on in stories cloaked as warnings to their own children. Obey the priest, but never be alone with him. Generations learned the same lesson, passed not through open speech, but through unease, through glances, through silences that said more than words could. In the great chronicles of medieval history, these children are invisible, yet their absence is its own testimony. Silence is never empty. It is the shape left behind by voices that were never allowed to speak. This was the life of the victims. Ordinary children, bound by obedience, erased by silence, remembered only in the shadows of the chapels where they once stood, eyes wide, hearts racing, waiting for mercy that never came. The fear of children in medieval churches was not born only from individuals. It was born from a system, a structure that placed priests above question, and children beneath silence. This system was not accidental. It was designed, reinforced, and maintained over centuries. At its core was hierarchy. The medieval church was built on order, with God at the highest point, followed by Christ, the saints, the Pope, bishops, and priests. Beneath them came the faithful lords, peasants, widows, children. Each level depended on the one above. To disobey a priest was not disobedience to a man, it was disobedience to God. This belief was carved into sermons, painted on church walls, taught in catechism, and repeated in confessions. For a child, it meant that questioning the priest was the same as questioning heaven itself. Bureaucracy made this order unshakable. Every village belonged to a parish. Every parish recorded baptisms, marriages, and deaths. Each soul was accounted for. Children's names were written in ink at baptism, marked as belonging to the faith. To be excluded from this record was to risk eternal damnation. Priests controlled those records. Families could not risk offending them. In such a world, a child's word carried no weight against a cleric's pen. Economy also tied children to priests. Tithes, 1/10 of a family's harvest, were paid to the church. Peasants handed over grain, eggs, or livestock. In return, they received sacraments, blessings, and protection of the soul. But protection came with conditions. To accuse a priest, even in whispers, could threaten the family's relationship with the church. Losing that bond was unthinkable. Fear of hunger and fear of damnation pressed together, silencing victims before they could speak. Ideology sanctified silence. The vow of celibacy was meant to elevate priests, separating them from earthly desires. Yet the existence of that vow made accusations of abuse almost impossible to believe. To suggest that a priest could harm a child was not only to accuse a man, but to accuse the sacred office itself. Communities often dismissed such claims as slander, or worse, as the work of the devil trying to discredit the church. In this way, the system defended itself, turning suspicion back upon the victims. Confession reinforced the imbalance. Children knelt, whispered sins, and awaited absolution. The priest's questions could be probing, his presence suffocating. But the act was cloaked in ritual, legitimized by the authority of the sacrament. In confession, the child was vulnerable, stripped of secrecy. The priest, by design, knew everything. That knowledge became power, and power, when unchecked, became weapon. The system was not without attempts at correction. Councils condemned immoral priests. Bishops wrote edicts forbidding abuse. Yet punishment was rare. The church feared scandal more than sin. When priests were caught, they were often moved to another parish, their crimes left unspoken. Communities learned to forget quickly. The cycle continued. For children, the system was a net with no escape. Authority demanded obedience. Bureaucracy erased their voices. Economy punished their families for speaking. Ideology sanctified their silence. Confession exposed their secrets. Each thread bound them tighter until resistance was unthinkable. The strength of the system was not in its violence, but in its normalization. The fear of children was not extraordinary. It was ordinary. It was expected. It was built into the daily life of medieval Europe, hidden behind the sound of church bells and the glow of candlelight. This was the system that allowed fear to thrive, a system that cloaked itself in holiness, but carried shadows within its walls. Abuse in the medieval church did not exist as a single act, or as a moment that ended when the candles burned out. It existed as a cycle that began in silence, grew in secrecy, and carried itself forward through generations. For children, the pattern was always the same. A moment of fear, an unwanted touch, a whisper pressed too close to the ear. Then came the silence. They told no one, or if they did, they were dismissed. Parents, bound by faith and fear, chose not to hear. Villagers whispered but did not act. The priest remained untouched, his robe still black, his voice still commanding from the pulpit on Sunday. The child grew. carrying memory as a wound that did not heal. For some, it became a scar hidden deep, never spoken of again. For others, it turned into quiet warnings passed to their own children, warnings that did not name the priest, did not speak of abuse, but carried unease in phrases like "never be alone" or "keep your distance." In this way, silence was inherited, taught as survival. The institution itself reinforced the cycle. When scandal arose, bishops intervened not to protect victims, but to protect the church. Priests were transferred to other parishes, far enough away that whispers could not follow. In the new village, the cycle began again. New children, new silences, new shadows. Communities adapted, accepting the movement of priests as routine, never knowing what was carried with them. This repetition was not accidental. It was structural. The church valued its reputation above all. To admit abuse was to weaken the foundation of faith. To weaken the foundation was to risk losing tithes, obedience, souls. So it chose silence. And silence allowed the cycle to continue. The children themselves rarely broke it. In a world where obedience was survival, they had no voice strong enough to resist. Even as adults, few spoke openly. Those who tried found their words dismissed as slander or condemned as heresy. To accuse the church was to place one's own soul in danger. Few dared. Thus the cycle endured across centuries. From one generation to the next, fear was passed like an heirloom. The same chapels, the same crucifixes, the same whispered warnings. The victims changed, but the pattern did not. The abuse was not remembered as a single crime. It was remembered as atmosphere, as dread, as something always present in the background of childhood faith. The cycle's power lay in its invisibility. Nothing was written. Few dared speak. The traces are faint, scattered in sermons condemning wicked priests, in records of bishops forced to intervene, in legends of clerical corruption. But the children themselves are missing from the page. Their fear left no words, and yet their silence, multiplied across villages and centuries, is its own form of evidence. What was endured in one century was endured in the next. The shadow did not fade with time. It became tradition, cloaked in ritual, strengthened by silence, a cycle unbroken until it became part of the fabric of medieval life itself. The legacy of these silences did not end with the Middle Ages. The fear carried by children in stone chapels, the weight of whispers unheard, remained woven into the story of the church. Centuries later, when archives opened and hidden records came to light, the same patterns appeared. Transfers of priests, communities left in confusion, victims erased, their pain dismissed as rumor. The cycle that had begun in medieval villages cast a shadow long beyond their walls. For the children who lived in that age, the consequences were immediate. Fear shaped their memories, their faith, their sense of safety. Some grew to adulthood, wary of priests, wary of confession, wary of the crucifix that had once watched in silence. Others buried the memory so deeply that it lived only in unease, a shadow passed on through warnings to their own sons and daughters. The fear itself became inheritance, not written in charters or laws, but carried in the rhythm of family life, in the way trust was withheld from holy men, in the way silence was taught as survival. For the church, the consequence was corruption that hollowed out its own authority. Each act of abuse, each silence chosen over truth, ate at the moral foundation it claimed to guard. Yet because the institution valued reputation over repentance, the damage remained hidden. Faith endured, but beneath the hymns and rituals there was rot. The crucifix still hung, the candles still burned, but the silence of the victims lingered like smoke in the rafters. And for history itself, the consequence is absence. We cannot read the voices of the children. Their words were never written. What remains are fragments, council decrees, condemning unnamed abuses, chronicles hinting at unholy priests, records of bishops quietly moving clerics from parish to parish. The children are gone, but their absence is a testimony of its own. Silence is not emptiness, it is evidence of erasure. In the end, the consequences of clerical abuse in the medieval world are not measured only in numbers, or in laws broken, or in trials recorded. They are measured in silence, silence that lasted lifetimes, silence that turned fear into tradition, silence that allowed the shadow to stretch from century to century. The chapels remain, the crucifixes remain, but beneath the stone and wood lingers something darker, the memory of children who learned that fear was holy, and silence was survival. Two truths remain. Power cloaked in holiness can become the most dangerous power of all, and the silence of the smallest voices can echo longer than the prayers of the mighty.